As you think to yourself about the beginning of the story that culminated in 9/11, where does this story begin?
As a storyteller, I chose to start in 1948, which is the year Sayyid Qutb, who was an Islamic educator and scholar and writer, came to America. He was actually sort of on the run. You know, some friends had gotten him to get out of the country because he was being too critical of the monarch. And so he came to New York and then went to Greeley, Colorado. What was surprising to me is that that was a time when America's standing in the world was higher than it had ever been, especially in the Arab world in many respects, because we didn't have a history of colonization, didn't have the taint that European countries had in that region. Also, Greeley, Colorado, where he went, was a teetotaling town. No liquor sold. There was a church on nearly every corner. So very religious like he was. And you would think this would be the ideal spot for this very pious, a little bit sanctimonious Islamic scholar to settle down. But he hated it, everything about it. He didn't like the way people paid attention to their lawn care. He didn't like the music. He didn't even like the way they cut his hair. And so he experienced America at a time when Americans thought pretty highly of themselves. But he was a dark-skinned Egyptian, so he saw another side of America that a lot of Americans at that time wouldn't acknowledge. I remember talking to some of his roommates, and Qutb loved American movies, and they all went over to the theater. The theater owner said, "Yeah, you can't come in, you're Negroes." And one of them said, "No, no, we're not Negroes, we're Egyptians." "Oh, okay," he says, "in that case, come on in." And Qutb holds himself up and says, "If you will not let a black American in, this black Egyptian refuses to enter." So he saw things about America that we didn't see at the time. And he carried those criticisms, just and unjust, back to Egypt and wrote about them very influentially.
Well, he is, in intellectual circles, he becomes a critical player in not just the formulation of an anti-American critique, but also the formulation of a rallying cry for Muslims, as he saw it, the principles upon which he believed that they ought to unify themselves and govern themselves. And he becomes sort of a central player through the 1950s up to the point at which Nasser has him executed in prison in the mid-60s. Can you describe his influence, both in broad societal terms? What did he represent and what did his views represent within Egyptian society? And then, of course, the influence that those views had on the next generation of people who would emerge in Zawahiri and others as the leaders of the Egyptian Islamic underground movements and ultimately onto Al-Qaeda.
It's interesting how every important political movement always goes back to a book. You know, whether it's Das Kapital or, Mein Kampf or whatever, there's always a book at the base. And the book at the base of radical Islam is Ma'alim fil Tariq, which is signposts along the way, or milestones, as it's usually translated. That's the book that Sayyid Qutb wrote in the Egyptian prisons. And all of the Islamists of the future, Zawahiri, bin Laden, read that book. In there, he talks about how Muslim society is no longer really Islam, that you can't even speak of Islam today, that it's really in a state of what he calls Jahiliyyah, the world before Islam. And it's the duty of Muslims to purify their society, beginning with their leaders who are corrupt and infidels because they won't impose Sharia, the pure Islamic law. And therefore, he calls for a vanguard of radical young Muslims to spring up and overthrow those governments and purify those societies. That vanguard is what Al-Qaeda would eventually become, or see itself as being. Now, there's a personal connection here. The last man to see Sayyid Qutb alive before he was executed was Zawahiri's uncle, Mahfouz Azam. He was Qutb's protege, his lawyer, and and Qutb handed him his personal copy of the Quran before he went to the gallows. Sayyid Qutb is, hallowed in that family. Zawahiri, the nephew of Mahfuz Azam, must have been deeply, deeply affected by Qutb's death, because he started a cell to overthrow the Egyptian government that same year, 1966, when Qutb was hanged. Zawahiri was 15 years old.